Thanks for tuning in to Higher Rock Education. I hope that you find this video helpful. The money supply is increased when banks lend money. In the monetary policy lesson, we discuss how the Federal Reserve or any central bank manages the economy by manipulating the money supply. This video describes how the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. Each of its tools ultimately increases the amount banks have to lend. Because believe it or not, when banks lend money, the money supply is increased. That's right. When banks lend money, the money supply increases. M1 is the most limiting measure of the money supply. It includes only the most liquid of assets, currency in circulation, traveler's checks, and demand deposits. Now, demand deposits are just a fancy name for checking accounts. Before we go any further, it's important to understand the difference between a bank's balance sheet and other balance sheets. A balance sheet summarizes an individual's or business's financial position at a given point in time. Assets are placed on the left side. An asset is something of value that is used to create wealth. It may be cash you hold, money you have deposited with your bank, your car, or an investment you have made, such as your home or a stock you purchase in a company. Liabilities are listed on the right side of the balance sheet. A liability is simply something that you owe. It may include your student loan, credit card debt, and a car loan. Hopefully, the total value of your assets exceeds the sum of what you owe. And if true, then you have a positive net worth. Net worth is simply the difference between your assets and liabilities, and it appears below the liabilities on the balance sheet. The sum of liabilities and net worth must equal your assets. Table 1 is John's balance sheet. John banks at Third Federal. Note that John's assets total $17,000 and include $5,000 cash that he has deposited at Third Federal and his car valued at $12,000. His liabilities include his $9,000 car loan. The difference between his assets and liability equaled John's net worth, or in this case, $8,000. For banks, the balance sheet looks a bit different. Like John, cash held at the bank or on deposit at the Federal Reserve are its assets. But John's deposits are Third Federal's liabilities. Why? Because Third Federal owes John this money. If John chooses to withdraw the funds, Third Federal must pay him. Think of John's deposit as a loan to Third Federal. Third Federal uses these deposits to make loans to families and businesses. Now, another difference between John's balance sheet and Third Federal's balance sheet is that John's car loan is an asset for Third Federal. Why? Remember, assets generate wealth, and loans generate a bank's wealth. Table 2 is Third Federal's balance sheet. Cash on hand, deposits with the Federal Reserve, and loans are its primary asset. That's right. Banks maintain deposits with the Federal Reserve. Think of the Federal Reserve as being a banker's bank. Third Federal's primary liabilities include the funds it holds as deposits for its customers, and its net worth is the difference between its assets and liabilities. So let's assume that Third Federal holds $30 million in cash and deposits at the Federal Reserve and has $270 million in loans outstanding. Its total assets are $300 million. Assume that it holds $250 million in deposits. Third Federal's liabilities equal $250 million, and its net worth is $50 million. Now let's return to how the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. It has several tools, but each one results in more money being available for banks to lend. Why? Because recall that when a bank lends money, it increases the money supply. The Fed may purchase Treasury bonds to increase the money supply. So let's assume that $10 million is purchased through various dealers. These dealers instruct the Fed to deposit their money in their bank. Remember, banks have accounts with the Federal Reserve. Do you think the Federal Reserve deposits cash into these accounts? No! It simply credits the money into the bank's account with the Federal Reserve. Again, let's simplify and assume that all is deposited at Third Federal. So the Federal Reserve credits Third Federal's account by $10 million. Table 3 is Third Federal's revised balance sheet. Note that its deposits with the Federal Reserve and assets increased by $10 million. But its liabilities, the amount deposited by the dealers, also increases by $10 million. What just happened to the money supply? Well, remember, M1 includes demand deposits. Demand deposits just increased by $10 million. So the money supply just increased by $10 million. But guess what? It doesn't end here. Third Federal can then use the increase in deposits with the Federal Reserve to lend to others. It now has $10 million it must do something with. So assume that it wants to keep $1 million in reserve to serve its customers' daily needs. That leaves $9 million it can lend to the community. It's important to understand what is done with the loan proceeds. So let's just get a little personal. Assume that you borrow $10,000 from a bank to buy a car. Do you think the bank would give you cash? No, the bank writes you or the car dealership a check. Now, what do you or the car dealership do with that check? Well, what really matters is that you or the car dealership deposits the check. Returning to the economy as a whole, let's assume that the proceeds from all $9 million in loans are deposited at Third Federal. What just happened? Table 4 summarizes Third Federal's balance sheet after the loans. Remember that the definition of money supply includes demand deposits, so the money supplies just increased by $9 million, or the total amount of the loans. But it doesn't end here. Third Federal now has $9 million more in reserves, and it can lend $8.1 million from it. Economists refer to this as the multiplier effect. The monetary multiplier effect is the increase in the money supply that results when banks lend out more than the amount deposited. In our example, $10 million was deposited, and after 2 rounds, the money supply increased by $17.1 million. But we only went 2 cycles. Banks could continue lending using the added deposits. Table 5 shows the amounts a bank could lend in the first 10 cycles if it maintained 10% in reserves and began with a $10 million increase in the money supply. But it still doesn't end after 10 cycles. In fact, if the reserve requirement is set at 10%, then it's possible for the money supply to increase by 10 times the amount of the initial deposit. That $10 million deposit could increase the money supply by $100 million. Remember in our example that Third Federal's management chose to retain 10% of its deposits to handle its daily needs? This is Third Federal's reserve requirement. In the U.S. economy, the Federal Reserve sets the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is the minimum percentage of deposits that a bank or thrift must hold in its vaults or on deposit with the Federal Reserve Bank. This money cannot be loaned or invested. It's reserved to handle the daily cash needs of the bank. For example, assume the reserve requirement is set at 10%. If a bank holds $10 million in deposits, then it can lend $9 million. The Federal Reserve can directly increase the money available for banks to lend by reducing the reserve requirement. If the reserve requirement is reduced to 8%, then the bank can lend $9.2 million. At the time this is being filmed, the reserve requirement is approximately 10% in the United States. In conclusion, A central bank is able to manage the money supply by manipulating the reserves banks have to lend. Increasing the amount of money banks have to lend increases the money supply, because the money supply is increased when banks make loans.